of some nations. Section: Immigration, Imperialism, and Citizenship. Shachar refers to the birthright lottery of citizenship, whereby the morally arbitrary fact of a person's birthplace conditions their citizenship, which in turn determines their life chances. It is the persistent global inequalities and attendant differences in citizenship rights that bear most heavily on the migratory process. Though some welfare rights have been extended to non-citizens in recent years, citizenship remains a crucial variable in this regard. While contributor benefits are largely insurance-based and accrue through participation in the labor market, non-contributory transfer payments such as income support, disability benefits, and housing benefits are very much tied to national status, insofar as non-citizens are excluded or entitled only to significantly lower levels of benefit. Many countries place severe restriction on access to such non-contributory social programs, and, moreover, immigrants' rights tend to be highly stratified according to entry categories. Thus, immigrants in great demand are enticed with attractive packages of rights. Temporary immigrants are offered more limited rights, and unwanted immigrants are deterred by restricting their rights, including, for instance, in respect of permanent residency and the right to bring family members. The subordination of migrant labor relative to native labor is not only observed in the sphere of social rights, but also in terms of employment rights, granting access to the labor market itself. Access to private sector jobs is typically restricted according to a person's immigration status, with low-skilled immigrants, for instance, only admitted to work in particular sectors or for particular employers. In European countries, employers are legally obligated to conduct a labor market test to show that no domestic worker, a national or a European Union citizen, is available before they can employ a foreigner. In addition, there is great variation between states as to whether they allow members of the migrant's family to work immediately. Meanwhile, national citizenship is a precondition for employment in a range of public sector jobs in countries as different as France, hospitals, postal service, Germany, civil service jobs, including public transport and education, and the United States, public school teachers, state troopers, probation officers. While political, electoral enfranchisement, social, and labor market rights are conditioned by the citizen-alien boundary and stratified according to various statuses within the subordinate category, even in liberal states, civil rights, too, are restricted for non-citizens. Since the beginning of the so-called War on Terror, aimed not at restricting political violence against civilians, but at subjecting the energy-producing states of Central Asia and the Middle East to a new round of imperialist discipline, governments in the United States and, latterly, Western Europe have implemented draconian police measures affecting non-citizens. Thus, for instance, in the case of persons imprisoned without charge by U.S. authorities in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, certain national governments with sufficient political influence in the United States were able to lobby for, and in some cases secure, the release of their citizens, starkly revealing the hierarchical nature of the right to diplomatic protection and national citizenship. Indeed, the Patriot Act in the United States allows the government to deport or detain non-citizens without a trial if the Attorney General suspects them of terrorist activity, while in the United Kingdom, the Labour government responded to the September 2001 attacks in the United States with legislation that allowed for indefinite detention of non-citizens without trial if the Home Secretary, quote, reasonably believes that a person is a terrorist. Those, quote, post-nationalist theorists who emphasize the erosion of national boundaries and national legal frameworks for understanding processes of international migration ignore the centrality of citizenship to people's ability to move across state boundaries. Barriers to international mobility are significantly higher for some national citizens than for others, and a person's citizenship affects their capacity to travel to another country for a short period of time, either for work tourism, or to visit family. Whereas citizens of countries in the global north can regularly travel freely to other such countries without a visa, and sometimes even without a passport. Citizens of most states in the global south are required to apply for a visa to enter most states of the global north, with visa management closely correlated with the wealth and citizenship of a country with strong and stable interstate relations. Crucially, citizenship rights and their relative absence shape people's desire to migrate in the first place, with nominally post-national human rights law having little relation to international reality. Whereas the citizens of highly developed countries enjoy extensive formal rights and institutions capable of upholding these, those of transitional countries have fewer formal rights and less powerful institutions, and persons residing in the poorest countries of the global south, quote, may be citizens in name, but not in reality. Even were it not to reproduce differential citizenship, however, international migration law restricts the rich as well as the poor from risking their lives to find a home in countries where human life is incomparably easier for the average citizen than it is in much of the rest of the world. Footnote. In 1894, Anatole France wrote, quote, in its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread. End quote, and end of footnote. Imperialism today entails the globalization of capitalist production processes, relying on the intensive exploitation of labor in the less developed countries. The globalization of capitalist production is characterized by increased foreign exchange transactions, international capital mobility, transnational corporate expansionism, and the economic ascendancy of financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. In part, globalization was a means for imperialist capital to circumvent the national social pact it had made with the metropolitan working class within the confines of the nation-state system. Insofar as the metropolitan labor aristocracy had the political and institutional strength to prevent the crisis in profitability affecting its living standards, stagflation followed and contributed to further systemic crisis. Leading sections of the ruling bourgeoisie, particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States, therefore sought to implement a restructuring of global capital that would overturn social democratic, socialist, and developmentalist projects throughout the world. The resulting set of policies would become known as neoliberalism, an ideology that stresses open markets and private enterprise as the principal engines of economic and political advancement internationally. The massive expansion of accumulation by dispossession, accompanying the spread of neoliberalism in the global south, has produced a, quote, virtually inexhaustible immigrant labor reserve for global capitalism. There are at least three major benefits that capitalists derive from this immigrant labor. First, it is rendered vulnerable, deportable, and, as a result, subject to higher levels of exploitation than pertain for the native working class. Second, the construction of apparatuses of control in the form of private, profit-seeking detention centers, militarized borders, and the military and surveillance hardware necessary to policing immigration has become an important site of accumulation. Finally, anti-immigrant policies designed to create a captive and highly precarious working class necessitate political tendencies that convert immigrants into scapegoats and distract the attention of the privileged section of the global workforce from the root causes of capitalist decline. The unity of the working class, already fractured as a result of the divergent living standards accompanying the division of the world into exploiting and exploited, imperialist and oppressed nations is further undermined by this ideological effect. The capitalist class is able to secure the optimal conditions for the higher exploitation of immigrant labor by means of 1. The division of the domestic workforce into immigrant and citizen, and 2. The racialization and criminalization of the former. Immigrant labor has historically flowed from the exploited countries to the imperialist countries in the capitalist system. Primarily, that is, from South and Central America and Asia into North America, and from Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia into Europe. In more recent years, however, as export-oriented industrialization has advanced in parts of the global South, quote, from the factories along China's southern coastal belt to the South African mines and farms, the Middle East oil meccas, and Costa Rica's service industry, end quote, immigrants have been drawn to less developed regions of the global economy. In both developed and less developed countries, immigrant labor faces the prospect of low wage, low status work, the denial of its rights, political disenfranchisement, state repression, bigotry, and nativism on the part of the domestic working class. In the case of workers in the major imperialist countries, however, this nativism is the product not simply of a desire to guarantee a monopoly for jobs for native workers. It is motivated by the at least tacit recognition that the bourgeois living standards these workers enjoy is predicated upon the maintenance of the imperialist subjection of foreign workers. Although typically experiencing relative economic deprivation and political marginalization, immigrants in the imperialist countries are nonetheless relatively able to enjoy the wage levels and other benefits accruing to legal residency therein. This has a decisive impact on the political culture of the less developed countries, with members of their middle classes aspiring to migrate to a developed country. In doing so, these groups acquire a greater material stake in the imperialist system, one which is increasingly reflected in a conservative political stance. In the metropolitan countries themselves, meanwhile, the marginalization and police repression of low-income black and minority ethnic populations provides the material, if not necessarily the ideological, basis for a much more progressive political outlook. In many instances, the wages of workforces divided along national and ethnic lines within a given economy compare poorly to the wages of more integrated metropolitan workforces therein. Compare, for example, the wages of southern U.S. workers to those of northern U.S. workers, or the wages of workers in Northern Ireland to the wages of workers in Britain. Yet such regional wage differences do not necessarily outstrip those encapsulated by discrimination wages. Moreover, particularly where the ratio between the wages of the mainstream and specially oppressed workforces exceeds or is approaching that between the proportional labor time each group expends within the productive sectors of the national economy, considered abstractly as a self-contained unit, there is a clear class rationale for labor aristocratic contempt for the specially oppressed domestic workforce. End of section.